Hello, everybody, and welcome back to the Fix My Fees podcast, where merchant services is so boring. I bring on interesting people and pick their brain so that they can drop some knowledge onto you. And I'm your host, Tavius Washington. And today I decided to take a different turn when it comes to how businesses are run and talk with someone who is a partner with Vectis Strategies and a co-founder of Hype Lab. But the unique side of it is you bridge journalism with corporate communication, right? And so you have worked at outlets like The Information and Los Angeles Business Journal. And so to move that into different aspects of crisis management and modern AI, it's pretty unique that you started from such a far background all the way up to being able to help corporate delegates. And so I thought it'd be great. So everyone, please welcome Matt Pressberg. How you doing today, Matt?
I'm doing well. Thanks for having me, Tavius.
Yeah. So you have been doing this for quite a while, but what is it when you say you mix journalism with corporate communication? What does that essentially mean?
Yeah. So, corporate communications, a lot of the role is, there's internal communications, there's owned media, but a lot of the role of corporate communications is earned media. It's getting the right stories in front of the right audiences and incredible sources. So a lot of that is placing stories in national publications, local publications, business outlets. And so I was a journalist. I was a business journalist in particular for a long time. And so a lot of corporate communications, they're trying to reverse engineer sort of how to get the story in there to the most advantageous way to the client. And, which is great, but it's also helpful to understand how the rhythms of a newsroom actually work and how stories get approved. And so I think with my background, having written these stories and having been an editor to, approve or reject some of these pitches to kind of know basically, what's realistic and help our clients find the best way in that, pushes the right message for their overall strategy and also is something that adds value to the newsroom. So reporters and editors realize that, we're not just coming in when we need a favor, but we're coming in to provide some interesting sources, interesting information that they can publish in their stories. And, as a byproduct, if, my clients get covered in a favorable way, I think everybody wins. So I try to bring a little bit of that journalism knowledge and I guess credibility to this role. And I find it to be a very helpful background.
Yeah, I definitely understand the credibility side and helping people build trust, especially new clients or new people coming into whatever brand it is. But why would someone want to blend journalism inside of their branding and how they're communicating inside of their business?
I think it's a great question. I think, it's a blend. I would say it's almost like a root stock and that kind of thing. So I think of it almost like a vineyard where, you're kind of, everything's kind of growing from the root, which is journalism. And so I think it is helpful. I think, there are corporate communications, I would say assets or just, we've all read corporate communications that have been written robotically and there's it's very much a sales document. There's not really news value in it. It's like here's our press release, here's our blog on our corporate site that tells you how great we are and why we're the best and that's it. And we're just awesome and you don't need to ask any questions because we're the best. We've told you how great we are. And so I think just the journalism training in terms of, show, not tell, which is a big thing, which is, instead of telling everybody how great you are, just, share some metrics. And I think that's one area where I think the journalism background, sharing this data point and not just sharing and sharing things that, it's not always the client, the company that knows what's interesting to the audience. And so sometimes having that journalist background, we're able to, again, unearth some data where, they may not have thought it was a big deal, but I think it's a big deal to be able to get it across in a way that, tells us, it shows through data and not just sort of, talking at people. And so I think that's a good way to think about it. And so in terms of, just the basics of storytelling, some evidence, some credibility, frame the story, build some suspense as opposed to sort of a staccato corporate press release. I think that's a good way to think about blending these techniques and I guess rhythms of journalism with successful corporate communications.
I like that. It's such a unique thing because it's taking something that where people may feel like it's just what has to be done in a boring way and adding a story and uniqueness to it that draws attention, which is always good, especially if that attention ends up spiraling to other attention because now other eyes are moving on. So walk me through your journey of how you even got it started in journalism to begin with and how that morphed into, hey, I'm going to start really helping these corporate
So,
figure.
so I will say this. So I am envious of people that knew what they wanted to do all along, had a path, had a plan, and sort of, I wanted to be a doctor. And so when I was 15, I did this, and I studied biology. I was pre-med. Like, that wasn't my thing. And so for me, I wasn't sure. I was kind of interested in business, writing, geography. I was one of those people that had a lot of varied, I guess, sort of, and some of them were esoteric and niche interests, but, kind of went through school, did that. I wasn't really sure what I wanted to do out of college. So ended up getting into a couple of business things, real estate, worked at a small private equity fund for a little bit. I wasn't great at it. I wish I was. I wish I was a great deal maker, but wasn't a particularly great analyst, but I was a pretty good writer, and I ended up doing some of our investor communication. So I wrote some quarterly memos, wrote some, took some of the, I guess, the research from some of our senior people and try to, craft it into deal memos. And so, I took that. The Great Recession hit in 2008. And so I was at that point, our fund wasn't doing as well. And so I was looking for, some new opportunities. And I realized that wasn't for me, but I thought that maybe this little investor communication business writing thing could be something. And so I took a bit of a chance. I went to journalism school. I was a little bit of an older student, went back to journalism school at USC. Did very well there, and thought that this could be a path. So studied business journalism, went out of that, went into the LA Business Journal as a reporter pretty much right away, and enjoyed that work, became the managing editor, and then, went around journalism for a little while. I was there. I worked at a place called International Business Times, worked at the Wrap, worked at the Information, which was great. And, I enjoyed being a journalist. I thought it was a lot of fun. It was definitely more in line with, I thought, my skill set than being a private equity analyst. But, as I'm a journalist and I'm interviewing people at companies and writing these stories, I kind of felt, drawn to is maybe not the right word, but I felt like I had, it was more of a fit for my skill set to kind of tell these stories internally. Like, I was sometimes better at in the process of interviewing and writing the story, telling the company story better than their internal, their comms team did. And sometimes they tell me that. They say, Matt, I wish we thought of that. This is great. And then I realized, okay, that's great. But, if I'm good at that, maybe I should try that side. And I did find it interesting. I think some journalists are very much, they don't find that interesting at all. And in some cases that makes them a very good journalist because, they're really interested in digging into it. They're okay to, they're okay not making friends with people. They're okay sort of, being a lone wolf. And I kind of like the idea of telling a company story. It was sort of how I started in terms of my transition into journalism, writing these investment memos. And so I thought that could be a path. And so I was at the Information, loved it there. And then I thought, this is kind of the pinnacle of journalism, let's explore that opportunity. And so a good friend of mine worked at Vectis Strategies. We had met when I was a journalist and he was pitching me stories. And so I kind of floated that to him, ended up connecting with him and the managing partner there. And then the rest is history, I guess. I joined as a senior advisor and then became a partner a little bit after that. And then, it's been great. I've been able to work on really interesting clients, worked on, tech companies, real estate, nonprofits, and it's been fun. And I feel like corporate communications, our firm values a journalism background. And so I feel like, right away I was able to, share my ideas, get involved at a high level, do some pretty interesting writing assignments, work on some media campaigns. And so it's been cool. So, it's been sort of a fortuitous falling into this field, but I felt like it was definitely not the straightforward journey, which I feel like, a lot of us have nowadays, being an entrepreneur, business person in America, sometimes, you go this way, but it came back to this and I've been in PR at this point about over 8 years and it's been phenomenal. And this is where I belong.
I love that. Tell us of one of the interesting or fun times that you've worked with someone that maybe you just took a different angle that they were expecting, or maybe the results were unexpected. Just tell us about one of those fun, interesting moments.
There's quite a few of these. And so I think, one that I like, and this kind of goes back to what we talked about, sort of that journalist background being helpful. And so I was working with a climate tech client. And so, they engage Vectis Strategies to help get coverage for their seed funding round and to get a little more hype. They had raised some money. They were doing some interesting stuff. And so, they brought us on. And so, I met with them and they, their priority was pretty clearly like, we want to get some coverage in the tech press for our seed round. This will give us some momentum to help appeal to, other investors, other potential partners we can collaborate with. They were in like the carbon trading industry. So a lot of their clients were like, multinational firms, companies that were looking to purchase carbon credits to offset their their emissions. So things like that. And so, I met with them, and then knowing this fact, I pushed back and I said, the tech press is great. Obviously we love to get funding of a seed round, but do your customers really read that? Where do you think your customers are? I think they're probably in the more generic business press. I don't think the CFO of an, industrial goods company is necessarily reading VC news as much as reading general business news. And so
Right.
we agreed on that. And then, the challenge was sort of getting into there. And so again, so one thing that they did have was they had a really good research director who had some really interesting reports on the industry. And so I asked for a lot of these reports as part of my, onboarding diligence with them. I read through one, and one had a pretty fascinating data point about sort of 1/3 of the revenue is being taken by brokers, by middlemen, which was a big spread in that industry.
Yeah.
And so that, that was, obviously lucrative for people in that industry, but it changed the economics pretty drastically. Like what companies are paying for carbon credits and what's actually going to the end user was pretty interesting. And so I thought that could be something. And so we ended up like not getting, they wanted their seed round and TechCrunch and things like that. We ended up pivoting. We got the seed round covered elsewhere, but we ended up pivoting. And, through that unearthing of that report, we ended up getting featured in the Wall Street Journal. And so that was something I thought was very cool because it was not on anybody's radar. And it was like, there's a little bit of disappointment at the beginning when I was like, like your seed round is probably not going to crack this. But I have something else that could be interesting. So there was a little bit of like, and I thought, that was something cool because a lot of PR people, and obviously you work for the client. And so a lot of them are just going to sort of sublimate their ideas sometimes and just be like, this is what the client wants, even though I don't know if this is what they want. And I thought that was cool because I have to be prepared to disappoint the client in terms of like what you want may not be happening, but
Right.
we're going to get something more important, even, something that's kind of unlikely, but because of the great work that you've done. And so I thought that was a fun one because it ended up being successful. We pivoted right away and was probably the best case scenario for that client. So I thought that was pretty cool.
That's awesome. That's cool.
Yeah.
So you do, when you're thinking about like even working with them and how you're kind of giving the strategic advice based on your research, based on what you know from the past and everything in your experience, you've done a lot with like public relations and public affairs. What do people get wrong about it? What is it that like people don't understand or they get wrong when it comes to how PR works or how communication?
Yeah. I am glad you asked that question because there's basically, a lot of, in a lot of businesses, like, success comes down to like, if you throw resources at it and you just, send make enough calls, send enough emails. If you're like aggressive enough, if you hustle hard enough, you're going to get results. And like that, it's like dating, it doesn't always work that way. Like either like if you're just like really annoying, that doesn't necessarily help you like find people, and PR is kind of the same thing. It's more of an art than sort of, a thing where you just turn the dial and you throw more bodies at it and you're just going to get a result. And so I think one thing people don't understand is like, it's not something that you can just brute force your way into success. Like you have to have you have to really have a strategy. And in some cases, it's not like there's sometimes you do want to pitch big news. You want to pitch more broadly across outlets and you're going to pitch to a good amount of people. But in many cases, in many of the more successful cases, it's like, yeah, we're going to spend 6 months like figuring out like this right angle to send this one email to this one reporter who's going to write a story 2 months later that's going to be worth everything we've done. And like that's sometimes a tough conversation to have where it's like,
It is, yeah.
so you're going to like do this. This is all you're going to like talk to this one person. Why don't I just give them a call right now? Because you're going to say the wrong thing and blow our opportunity. We have to approach this correctly. We have to make sure it's the right person. We have to time it correctly. And so there's a lot of like that kind of thing. And so I would say that's definitely one big misconception is that you like successful PR, like you're going to get results and a good PR person is going to like, for me, all I care about is, not how many case studies can I put on my website or things, how many things can I put my name on? It's basically like, what does the client need in terms of, PR, whether it's earned media, whether it's, AI visibility, things like that, showing up in answers when people ask ChatGPT and Claude to recommend stuff, which is, a big part of PR now. So basically like, what do they need to move the needle? Like what's bottom line? Like are they trying to get investors, customers, partners, things like that? And what can I do to help that? Like it's all about, the things, that I can do to help that and not vanity metrics that, I may be a PR firm cares about, but the client doesn't care about. And so I think that's really important. And a good client like trusts the PR firm to basically be like, okay, we hired them, like, and sometimes, and there'll be quieter times, there'll be intense times just based on the news cycle, based on what happens. And we kind of have to trust their judgment. And I would say, I would say that's definitely a big factor. And I think the other misconception is a lot of PR is like what doesn't come out. It's like the stories that could come out that never make it out because of, things we do to help answer journalists' questions without doing that necessarily publicly. And just, being able to get intel and sort of, I would say, PR people and journalists work in information markets. We're exposed to information, like we're familiar with that stuff. A lot of our value is our discretion in terms of we have a lot of proprietary information from our clients that they trust us with that we have to, basically, we have to roll out publicly on the right calendar, but, trusting our discretion, and help and basically the things that we do and sort of the stories that never come out that are a big part of our job too.
Nice. I definitely understand that because it does put a perspective on like what can happen. Because there was something I even read on you doing like crisis management. And I don't want you to give like an example of a client, right? Because I understand that can be sensitive. But what is that, right? Is it because when I think of it, I think of celebrities and their higher moments. But obviously, it can deal with businesses. So, what types of crises are you helping people with?
Yeah, I mean, and that could range from a lot of things. I mean, there's crisis that, the things that you know about where a senior executive has legal trouble and, you have to manage that accordingly. And there's a transition where, I think every PR person's been involved with, and I wouldn't say legal trouble. I would say there's, times when you work with high profile people that there's often unfounded allegations, which could get messy if they are not taken care of appropriately. So there's a lot of that. I think that's probably something that celebrity crisis communications has in common with just corporate crisis comms is there are opportunistic people that are trying to, they see dollar signs and they'll make outlandish claims. And a lot of our, there's a big part of that work that's just basically, verifying these things, kind of pushing back. A lot of times they're, once with a little pushback, they collapse. And so a lot of that is just protecting the principles. And then, there's things that are outside of the control. There's, obviously when there's wars that break out in countries and you have a client that has operations there, like, this is not a personal story, but I do have a colleague that was advising a company that had a lot of operations in Ukraine when Russia invaded. And so obviously, there's the critical thing, which is ensuring your employees are safe and all that kind of stuff. But there's obviously communications to investors and partners where it's like, hey, this whole team we worked with in Kiev, now it's being invaded and bombed and what's happening with the company, like, what's going on. And so that, I think, that's a part of crisis comms where just geopolitical events, things outside, weather events, that kind of stuff. We see that in Florida where, storms happen, things can go offline and you got to communicate. And so I think that that's part of it as well.
Yeah. I can see how
it
can be murky, but sometimes it's just about like, hey, listen, let's get the facts before everyone just blows everything, right? It's just kind of stopping the book because once the train hits, even if all the facts are there and if the train already takes off, it's the stuff that you can undo. So I can understand that back end side of keeping things until we get
and I think one important point that I'd also add is that, one key thing in crisis comms, and just for your general audience, people who may not be in the market to hire a PR firm, just, small business people that end up in a situation where, one important thing is message discipline. Is the worst thing that happens is this person said this and this person said something that totally contradicts. Like we've seen it in like sports when this kind of things happen and like they're not on the same page. I'm like, okay, like where there's smoke, there's fire. Somebody's getting traded, like this kind of thing. And so, yeah. And so I think one critical thing is that if there is a situation where there's, a crisis situation, something that you're going to get a lot of inquiries about, like, it's important to sort of get all your spokespeople, your principals on the same page, get in a room, get on the call, come up with even a 2-sentence statement, like a holding statement, like this is a statement. And this way, like, if you do nothing else, like people will reach out, like you just say, copy and paste the statement in the email, read it to them on the phone. And if everybody's saying the same thing, that's agreed upon. Then like, even if there's nothing else happening after that, then you've bought yourself time and credibility.
Right.
Yeah.
One part of what you were saying was talking about AI.
Yeah.
How are you working with people who are dealing with AI or are you yourself implementing AI in what you do?
So I am implementing AI pretty heavily at Vectis Strategies. And so one thing I did talk about is AI visibility is becoming a thing. And so obviously, part of PR is you get the story out there, but then there's also, SEO, where you get the kind of stories out there that when people are Googling and asking certain questions, which is the best company in the field? Like, is this company ethical? Should I hire this company? Give me stories that, again, there's one thing where like, sources from the corporate blog are saying stuff. And then there's more credibility when the Wall Street Journal or a local, accounting publication is also saying something where you're going to trust them a little more. And so part of PR for a long time was, getting these things out there. And so they'd show up in SEO. And now AI visibility or AEO is becoming really, I wouldn't say it's displaced Google yet, but it's getting closer. A lot more people now are just asking, instead of, Googling things, or asking ChatGPT, hey, my air conditioning broke. I need, who should I hire in the area? Or like, I got in a car accident, what's the best lawyer to recommend? Or, hey, like my grandfather had this office building, like it's in my estate now. Who's a good broker? Who's a good developer for me to reach out to? Who knows the space? So all kinds of questions like that they're asking AI. And one thing that I guess PR people like about AI is that the models are getting smarter and they're getting more skeptical. And one thing that they're doing is they're really looking for earned media. They love citing third-party sources because there's certain credibility there. They can triangulate against those sources. They love that kind of stuff. And so being in these outlets can really help generate the kind of responses when you prompt these AI models that you want. And so a big part of our practice is studying that. And so at Vectis Strategies, we've built our own AI visibility audit tool, which, we've used it internally on our clients so far. We've just started actually, publicizing it. And so where we run a bunch of, we focus, we have a lot of work in real estate and nonprofits. We've built it pretty heavily around those fields. It expands to other verticals, but it asks, we generate a bunch of custom prompts around, for clients in that space, show what comes up in the models, what sources they cite, and it helps us, just determine sort of what things are missing out there, what outlets we should focus more on, who's sort of getting cited highly in the most important answers. So a lot of that is definitely a big part of it. And so, I think in our industry in PR, if you're not thinking about this, you're living in the past a little bit. So I would say that that's a really important application of AI. And then of course, like, we're all using, AI to help improve our workflow. And so, I built a couple agents that just, scrape some news and help me identify stories that, about my clients that I can go ahead and analyze and maybe, find some other angles to pitch with them as well. And so I would say there's sort of that like work hacking or productivity hacking a lot of us are doing. And then, the AI visibility, I would say, is sort of a very big thing in PR and communications in general. But that's where a lot of things are going.
It's funny that you mentioned like how AI is going back to looking into credibility and looking for different sources to kind of confirm, being skeptical, more curious than blasting them out. And it's almost like the internet's gone back full circle again to backlinks. I remember how important that was.
Yeah.
So the spiders could crawl. And it was like, if you get as many like sources, you could do it affiliates and things like that, they could get it out there. And then it was like, okay, well now it's more about just being in the top page of Google. And now those all the way back to, hey, you need to have journalist pieces and things that people are tagging you in to go back to the AI working for you. And so do you think that AI will play a huge role in like how people are deciding if a person is credible by just it, or do you think people will dive in more after the AI? You get what I'm saying? Like, do you think people will take AI at face value, or do you think it'll take the links and dive into those too?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. I think, I would say I hope that people dig into the links. I think a lot of people do take AI as face value, but I guess what gives me a little comfort is that it's getting smarter. And so even what, sort of what AI summarizes, it is pulling from actual sources. So it's the kind of thing where even if the end user never, the end user who calls, the company and becomes a customer, becomes an investor based on that AI result, even if that person never sees the underlying link, their behavior could be driven by that coverage. And so I think that's helpful. But I think, to your point where it is kind of back to basics, where for a while there was like, I'm not going to call it cheap tricks, but there was like some shortcuts. I would say it's just shortcuts you could take with SEO where like you could game the system a little bit, and it wasn't, now it is, it's funny because, AI obviously is generating generating text, generating responses, but it is a more like holistic way of synthesizing the information. So I am heartened by it. I do think we're starting to see like obviously, like I subscribe to a lot of PR publications. They're all talking their own book. They're like, PR budgets are going to double. It's a great time. Like, I do think there is that, I don't know if I buy into all that optimism, but I do think that people are starting to see this. And I've personally received some inbound from people that have, I would say tech forward potential clients or just, businesses that have reached out that have said like, hey, like we've focused a lot on SEO recently. Like we've been digging into AI visibility and AEO and all this stuff. And so that made us realize that we need more of an earned media plan. And so it was like, it's wonderful that like, it's not just like basically a pitch that PR people are making, which we believe in, but it's something that people who are studying AI are coming to that conclusion as well. So that's heartening, I would say.
Yeah, and there's something I just thought of. Like we're on a podcast. That's technically a media outlet.
Yeah.
Does provide some credibility. Does any part of what you're doing have podcasts? Do people need to go on podcasts to talk about certain things or clear their name? I just thought about it. I'm like, you know what? Kind of what I'm doing here is a little bit of journalism too. So that kind of, does podcast play a role in anything that you're doing?
Yes, I would say this. I would say yes. AI does, because again, podcasts will generate some rich content. We've been talking here for a while. We've said a lot of words. There's a lot of information a lot of bytes of information out there from this conversation. So I would say that, I think yes. And I think especially podcasts that publish a transcript, whether it's even a YouTube transcript or just like the gold standard, what we found just from an AI visibility perspective, what we found out is publishing just a transcript on kind of a dedicated website because AI models like scraping that as well. And so yeah, so I think, and that we've been encouraging, a client recently, we've been encouraging him to step up the podcast book. And we have a couple book this month for him because of this reason that, we've had some news out earlier. There's not a, we're in between news announcements, but again, like he has interesting things to say. And the AI models do like to pull from podcast transcripts because it's a credible third party. It's not, it's not blog on the company site. It has a certain, I guess, whatever markers they put in there, the models do like to pull from them. So we found that, and that's behavior that we're encouraging with our clients as well.
Yeah. One thing I want to ask you, why is, I can tell like when you're talking about journalism that you kind of light up. Why is journalism so, I guess, fascinating or dear to you? What is it about that really like gets you going? Because I can tell just from the way you like
yeah.
Yeah,
it's fun. Like I love reading. I've always been, I've always, since I was a kid, I've always liked reading stuff, and not just like, I'm not going to say that like I was reading the encyclopedia at 3 years old, but like I like reading kind of like just, even like business news, like travel news, like more so than, short stories about fiction. And so I've always kind of been into it. I've always thought like telling stories about companies and people and places was interesting to me. And so, I feel like there's a little bit of romanticism in terms of what journalism was and where it is now. And I'm hopeful, again, I'm realistic, but I'm hopeful that the AI renaissance will value journalism and will, through, I guess, market forces, push more resources into journalism, which will in turn, like, build that back up from, it used to be like, there was a golden age. There was, magazine journalism where people had fancy offices in New York and expense accounts with nobody looking at them. And then there was sort of the, and I was part of it. I worked in journalism when it was contracting and in sort of this early Facebook, social media where everybody was sort of pivoting to video for the algorithms and things like that. And just, news outlets also missed, I think, the business case on the internet. They started putting all their content out there for free. It became commoditized in a lot of ways. And so there were some mistakes made. And so I think there's a little bit of like romanticism in terms of like what it was. Yeah. There's also, as you, and as you identify, like I do light up talking about it. I like reading stuff about it. I just enjoy it. I'll sit there and read like, I was reading the other day, like I found some article in like some old Hawaiian magazine about like some group on the west side of the island, like an 8,000 word article that like, I was like, this is fascinating. I'm going to read it. It's not something everybody does. I get that. So I've always been into like old school magazine journalism and the storytelling and the sort of the skills it takes to do that well. And like the value it has, like reading it decades later and really giving me a real perspective into what that world was like. And so I think it's cool. And on a hopeful note, I think that, hopefully as AI like values these journalistic articles that we'll see more resources in there. We'll see more people wanting to do it because they'll see a future that frankly wasn't really there in the last couple, I don't know, 10 years or so.
Yeah, I do know what you talk about. There was an age where it felt like local journalism fed the bigger people what they
Yeah.
did, right?
Yeah.
But it was mainly driven by local. And now it just feels it's only like the bigger ones and they're kind of suppressing. But I can tell like there could be definitely a resurgence and
I
just
hope so.
being able to have local, your own local, I guess journalists, YouTube channels and Facebook
Yeah.
channels and different things like that.
Yeah.
That take it back ownership, right? Like kind of like that full circle.
We're seeing that. Yeah. And some of the independent newsletters and things like that, which again, I think is cool. And like, again, we're seeing like, it's helpful, like and it's somewhere where we try to put our clients because as some of the traditional outlets have shrunk, like you're seeing some really good, like Substack newsletters, podcasts, things like that. And so, if that's where the audience is and that's a valuable conversation for the client, like I'm all about putting them there. There are old school people in PR who are like, if it's not the New York Times or whatever, but like, you got to go where the audience is today. The audience is different places.
Right. And I do start, the more we feel like the bigger names are propaganda wise, whatever the word is, the more people will start to listen to the local one, the guy who is living in Florida with us, in Orlando with you, that has this insight. You kind of listen to more than the person who goes, I'm just here and I've grabbed this story from whatever's going viral at the moment. So I definitely, well, what is something you would recommend as like a book or a newsletter? Somebody wanted to they starting to realize they like the journalism world or they like, what you're doing and they kind of want to start to follow the path. Can you name like a book or a newsletter that you would recommend for them to read?
That is a good, I was, that's a great question. I think, there's a few different things. So, I think in terms of like, I would, this is, this might be like a circuitous answer, but I would say, if somebody's looking to get into this, like one area what I would start is like kind of read the news coverage in the industry that, somebody's like, I'm into tech. I love to, tech PR, like read tech news coverage, read tech newsletters, read Casey Newton's newsletter, read MG Siegler's newsletter, read Cautious Optimism from Alex at TechCrunch. These are really good newsletters that I think, from longtime journalism perspectives that kind of show you what's going on in that space. So I would say read the works of journalism there, read the coverage in those industries. In terms of, kind of getting into corporate communications, one book that I think just anybody who's, the Elements of Style is a classic book about writing. I think that's a good place for people to start. Like if you want to get into like kind of writing or communications, that's a great way to sort of understand the basics, what makes a compelling story. That's not me giving any kind of brand new advice. That's advice that any journalism professor would give, but it's a great book. It's timeless. So I think, that's a good place. And then just, kind of read and write. And then, obviously, the trades like PR Week, O'Dwyer's, places like that, PR Daily. These are, again, places, the industry news sites that'll give you an update on basically kind of what the jobs look like in PR, what they will do interviews a lot with people who are senior practitioners. So I would recommend those, read interviews with people in the industry to kind of get an idea of what they do on a day-to-day basis. But it all kind of does come back to, in this industry, like a good place, it's an industry that, it's about producing content and about pitching stories that become that. So I would say a good, it's a little reductive, but I would say a good place to start reading is just like read the news coverage in the areas that you're interested in. And that'll give you a good guidance in terms of how to get into it. And then if there's certain reporters that you find are kind of really interesting, you come back to their byline, they cover your industry well, or they're missing some things about the industry, then that's an interesting place to start. Maybe you reach out to them and start a relationship, and then if you're at the point where you want to you have a real sort of larger PR campaign, then you can get there. You can have those building blocks in place.
I like that. I like the insight. Gives you, you give us like a wide range, especially once you go into something that actually has your interest and you can start with that. It's more apt that you're going to keep reading and reading and reading versus forcing yourself to just consume something for the sake of consumption. So I definitely understand that. And to kind of bring this full circle, who do you work with, right? In case someone's listening and they're like, I'm loving what Matt's talking about. I like the idea of bringing journalists in it. What are the types of clients that you're working with and how are you helping them?
Yeah. So a variety of different clients. So I'll say I've done a lot of work. I was a tech reporter, so a lot of tech clients. I know that space well. And then, real estate developers, real estate brokers. That's another industry where obviously telling your story often to skeptical audiences is a big part of it. And so, I feel like, in real estate, again, like there's obviously an understanding of the importance of the right messaging, the right story. And so I find clients like that interesting to work with. I covered real estate as a journalist as well. And so it's something I know well. And then nonprofits, especially nonprofits that need to raise money, that need to appeal to donors. Again, I find that to be often mission driven or purposeful work, especially an organization that I value. Like I'm telling the story to help them raise money to put to a great cause. So that's a nice, like, kind of working hard to do well and to like to do good, doing good to do well. I probably mixed that one up, but a little bit of that. And so those are, I would say, tech, real estate, nonprofits are a big one. Professional services, again, I like that space. I'm in professional services, so I know that well. And then, I would say, pretty broadly, like, a lot of, B2B, that kind of stuff. I would say, one thing that if you have like a consumer products company, that's something that, I'm happy to provide best practices. It's not something I personally specialize in. There's a lot of companies that really that specialize in sort of the consumer products and user PR. I prefer sort of real estate, tech, nonprofits, that more strategic approach.
Got it. I like that. Thank you for that insight. And so we got insight into who you help, how you work with them, even at 1,000-foot view. But outside of helping people through their crisis and through their journalism and broadening their communication in a better way that leads to more, positive outcomes, what do you do outside of work? What does Matt like to do in his free time?
So
other
Matt
than
likes,
read, I did get that part. You do read.
I do read. So I do like to read, but I feel like I have pretty normal hobbies. I love to travel. My wife and I love to travel. We've been to 50 countries or something. And so we like to be on the move. So that's something that we're both passionate about. We like cooking. I like to barbecue. It's a little hot in Florida right now to barbecue. So hopefully it gets a little cooler in the fall and winter. I like to do that a lot. I like to work out. I like to play a little basketball. I like to, I like to watch some sports. I guess pretty normal. Nothing too exciting. I feel like I have pretty standard hobbies: traveling, sport, barbecuing, hanging out with my friends. But yeah, I would say that kind of stuff. Definitely often reading something on my phone, a book in my hand too. So that's always part of it.
50 countries, just perfectly normal. No worries. No 50.
You know what? Hey, I'm able to do it. I'll say I'm very fortunate that, my job is wherever the internet is. And so I'm able to, like a true American, like even though I'm on vacation, I'm always working. And so like when I travel, it's always fun because I'll meet people and they're like, so you're taking the month off? I'm like, no, absolutely not.
Exactly.
Yeah. But
so do you have a favorite like destination that you've been to so far or one that you're looking forward to next?
A few that are, that are favorites. So, I'll say that like, this is cliche, but I would say like the best vacation we've ever taken was when we went on a safari in South Africa, which is phenomenal. That's, that's one where like when you see the animals up close, like it's like nothing else. It's like, it's a special, I was like, oh, that's a lion. That's a zebra. It's incredible to see that, like not in a zoo, to see basically to kind of, you're like in their kingdom, and it's like you have to, like they're the boss. Like when they want you to leave, it's like the Jeep has to go. Like the elephant says time to go, and it's like I have to respect you. And so I would say that's for I like my wife has a lot of family in South America, Argentina, and Brazil. So I've been there a lot. And then one place I will say is interesting. I'll give you like an unconventional recommendation. And so last summer, my wife and I were actually visiting some family friends in Poland, and then we were gonna go to Austria at the end of the trip. And so we decided to do a little bit of a road and train trip through Eastern Europe. And we ended up in the high Tatras in Slovakia, like some of the highest mountains in Eastern Europe. And that was great. Like I never thought I would be in the mountains of Slovakia, but beautiful place. Like it was like, again, it was the kind of thing where I was like looking over and taking photos of a waterfall and like deer in the forest. And it was like, didn't feel real. So I thought that was cool. I think, obviously like the big cities around the world, like, everybody loves New York, Paris for obvious reasons. They're fantastic, but there's some cool under the radar places where like, you meet people like, walking on this hill. I had a chat with some Dutch guy I'll never talk to again, but that's the magic of everything, Right. 3 hours with this guy. He went his way, I went my way. And then, but we had a special time up in the mountains of Slovakia. So it was pretty cool.
I love that, man. Thank you for that. I love that last part, because as much as we talk business, I do think people like to work with people that they think they would hang out with, right? And so knowing that we're
100%.
just normal people running, we may run
Look,
$1 million businesses. We may work with 10 million, $100 million business. We may work with them. But at the end of the day, sometimes we just like a home cooked steak.
you're right. Hey, it's like you're going to spend time. Like I would say to my clients, you're going to see me like at least bi-weekly on Zoom, if not in person or something.
Right.
Like you want somebody you can get along with. Like, you want, exactly. Yeah, that's an underrated part of enjoying work-life balance is just, having good people in both.
Exactly, man. Well, I want to thank you so much, Matt, for coming on here and bringing light to that, because I really do think that there is going to be a resurgence. And I do believe that people who are starting to get on the track, even before the crisis happens, but just being able to add journalism into their open communication, how they communicate with employees, investors, shareholders, even just their own subscribers to their own newsletters or different emails sequences, like everyone could add a little bit of that to what they're doing. So I'm glad you could come up here and shed light on that. Thank you again, Matt.
Thanks so much, Davies. This was fun. Thanks so much for having me.
And if anybody wants to reach out to you and they want to be able to ask you more questions, maybe they don't know if they're ready for you, or maybe they just kind of want to dive into more of like what it is you do to see if you can help them, how can they reach out to you?
I'm easy to find. You could find me at vectisstrategies.com. You could find me at mattpressberg.com. My email's there. You can get in touch with me pretty easily. So please reach out. Vectis is Vectis, Strategies, Strategies. And my name is Matt Pressberg, Pressberg.
Awesome. Thank you again, Matt. And thank you all for listening. I'll have that in the bio so that you can click on those links very easily. And again, as you see, Matt really does care about, what it is you do. Just reach out, see if he can help you, even if you're skeptical of whether or not he can do that. And thank you for listening. Go ahead and like and subscribe. And hopefully you got some more out of this than what merchant services can provide. Thank you for listening to another episode, and good night.